First of all, I want to say I'm honored to be here, and I'm probably not going to say anything that the people in this room aren't already aware of. I hope that I will have my, I hope I will contribute to the conversation by the way I present things and the way I cluster certain topics. As you know, my name is Greg Camilli. I'm from Rutgers University, and my experience in early childhood education has been through a number of meta-analyses, one which consisted of 123 preschool interventions, another meta-analysis that was aimed at phonics instruction in the early grades, and I've also done some work in longitudinal studies of growth in reading. So I come from that perspective, but also a perspective that I'm in a methodology program, so I teach research methods, and I'm interested in psychometrics as well. So I hope to bring some of those perspectives today. What I'm going to talk about is 4 kinds of effect on intellectual outcomes. I'm not saying these are the only outcomes of interest, but I think we all recognize that they have to be in the conversation today. These all actually have to be considered together because I don't think you can decontextualize the discussion of any one of them. And measurement issues are also, I think, pretty important in trying to understand these topics. Page down, not up. So I talk about a lot of these topics in terms of endogeneity, but what I really mean, endogeneity sounds good, I like to use the word, but what it really means is that there are hidden influences that may be partially submerged or completely submerged. And when I talk about hidden, I talk about being hidden to researchers. There are things going on in studies that researchers don't see, and this has an interesting relationship to the kinds of conclusions and generalizations that can be made. So I like to talk about getting the endogeneity out, and I used to I used to go to the gym after work, and there was this radio program called Getting the Lead Out, which was a program by, with Led Zeppelin's music, so that was inspired this. So there are really good techniques that econometricians and statisticians use to estimate program effects, and there are some people in this room that are very skilled in those techniques. But they're effects, they're not causes, and understanding the causes of those effects can be challenging. I'm going to argue today that the causes often can't be logically deduced. They're sometimes surprisingly related to the effects. But if the causes are unknown, it's hard to extrapolate what you know from a study to designing a new program. So let's see. So there's this idea that program effects are mediated through teachers, and that appears to be supported by a wide range of study. In other words, the program is delivered by teachers. But what teachers do is often submerged in the program label or official documents. And one illustration that the relationship of teachers to program effects is a little bit ambiguous comes from a study by Greg Duncan. And he found in a number of studies that the average effect size was pretty small for programs. 0.08, 0.04 to 0.8 is a pretty small effect. But he found another variable which is called percentage center care. This was the number of times that a child was observed to be in a program when assessment was being carried out. So it's sort of a proxy for program dosage, and that effect was 4 to 5 times larger than the program effect. So the question is this a variable for dosage or intensity? Because dosage, as we know from listening earlier, is a pretty complex issue. So the point here is that you have a big effect, but there's something hidden in the effect because the researchers don't have a really good description of what that variable represents. So I call that a hidden influence. It's also important to realize that when we look at treatments versus comparison groups, there are different types of comparison group. One is a comparison group where you don't understand what's going on. It's what people would have been doing anyway without the treatment. But there are other kinds of comparisons that are more precisely called alternative treatments. And it makes a difference how you interpret the effect of a program. It makes a lot of difference of what you're comparing it to. So in the What Works Clearinghouse report on Head Start, it was reported that children in the comparison group experienced diverse care in diverse settings. So when you look at the Head Start effect and you're saying, well, the effect looks small, what's it being compared to? Right, so unless you know what the composition of the comparison group is, it's hard to judge what the value of the program effect is. So what's the competitor? What's the competitor in terms of the alternative treatment? So here's a study from outside of early childhood education that might drive the point home earlier. It's a study of teacher absenteeism in rural India. Absenteeism is a problem in rural India because often the school is only one teacher in a classroom, so if the teacher doesn't come to school that day, there is no school. An experiment was designed to try to see if a series of incentives and penalties could decrease absenteeism. So all the teachers received a base salary of 1,000 rupees per day, and the experimental group teachers received 50 rupees a day for days they taught in excess of 20 days, and they received a 50 rupee fine for days they taught less than 20 days. So it was found that the experiment reduced absenteeism by about 20%, but when you looked at the data, there was no difference in average salary between the experimental and the comparison group. So the question is, how did it work? How did the treatment work? What was the causal mechanism by which absenteeism was reduced if it looks like the penalties and rewards canceled in the treatment group? So unless you know that, it's hard to say that you're going to be able to transport this information to another location and make it work. In other words, you have to understand that those hidden influences in the treatment to be able to wisely use this information in the future. So there are measurement issues in looking at the influences of teachers. There was a study in 2014 in Ecuador that examined the effects of teacher quality on child outcomes. Now, I'm not arguing that the studies I'm going to talk about today are widely representative of the literature. I'm just arguing that they illustrate certain problems with measurement that I want to point out. And the class instrument was used in that study, and that we know that the class assesses three broad domains: emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. Now, instructional support contains items such like concept development, quality of feedback, and language modeling. If you look at a factor structure of the class from the data from Ecuador, you see that there are three factors. The loadings in red for emotional support means all of the items within emotional support are more strongly correlated with factor one than the other factors. And you see a similar pattern for classroom organization and instructional support. If there wasn't a clear factor structure, you wouldn't see the red loadings all strongest for the domain to which they are connected. So this is empirical support that the factor structure proposed for the class really does exist. But it's also the case that factor one and factor two are correlated 0.67, pretty high correlation between those two things. So the question that rises in my mind as a psychometrician is how distinct are those two dimensions of quality? It looks like I did something terribly wrong with these slides. Okay. So let's take a look at the reliability of the of the class from the information from Ecuador. Now, this is the interesting thing. Remember, the mean is on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being high, 1 being low. So even though emotional support and instructional support are correlated highly, you see that the average across teachers for instructional support was 1.15. That indicates there was almost no instructional support observed, right? It's probably negligibly different from a baseline of nil. So the fact that emotional support and instructional support are correlated 0.67 maybe raises more questions than it answers. You also see that the reliability of the basic information, which were segments of videotapes, had a very, very low reliability in instructional support. Now, this is probably due to the fact that there was no variability in instructional support. You can't have reliability unless you have some variability. So these measurement effects are really important. You can't add the domains of the class together and try to correlate it with quality. My argument is you have to do it separately. And in fact, you might even disaggregate the class by the different dimensions within the domains. It's not a good psychometric technique to just add everything together so that you can get a variable with high reliability, because a lot of the information is contained in the individual domains. So this is also from the study in Ecuador. They found a one standard deviation increase in quality resulted in the following increases in language, math, and executive function. That's a good thing. They're small effects, but they're not zero. But why was the total class score used for these effects? That's my question. Why not take a look to see what the effect for instructional support was? My guess is it would be close to 0. The effect sizes would be close to 0. So my conclusion here is that subscores should be instructionally sensitive, and I'm also going to say that they need to be content-based. And I'm not the first person to say this by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're interested in looking at improvements in math achievement, you should have something that's sensitive to math achievement. But there's no evidence in this study that instructional support occurred, so the findings are ambiguous. So going to teacher qualifications, which is related to effects of teaching quality, a meta-analysis that I conducted with Pamela Kelly found small effects for having a bachelor's degree versus lower, and it was years of educational attainment was positively correlated with child outcomes. Now, for those of you who have conducted a meta-analysis, I want to say this was an extremely frustrating meta-analysis. Sometimes it felt more like magic computing those effect size than a scientific process. So what I conclude from this study is that the relationship between teacher qualifications and child outcomes is probably not less than 0. Other people have found no significant relationships, the early et al. Study. I think there is some mild evidence in there if you dig it out, but it's not strong evidence. And again, I would interpret it as there's mild evidence that the effect is not negative. A recent study which used a number of experimental methods like OLS with rich regressors, propensity score matching, I forget what the third method was. This is a dissertation by Gong, 2015, found some significant relationships, but they were inconsistent. So is there an effect of a bachelor's degree on children's outcomes? So the answer is a resounding maybe. I think that's a fair assessment, and I'm sure there are people who know a lot about that here, so I'll be waiting for your comments on that one. So the effects of teaching quality and teacher qualifications are not the same thing as teacher effects. Teacher effects are those things that econometricians and statisticians measure without knowing the causes. They're pretty good at controlling through other variables, through techniques like propensity score matching or instrumental variables. You still need to know what the cause is at some point. So in this study, it was found that the best teachers versus the lowest performing teachers had significant effects. That's not surprising, right? Better teachers have higher learning effects than the lowest performing teachers. Now, in all grades, you see that's the case in the US, but you also see it in early childhood education. Usually, you call these kinds of teacher effects, they come from value-added models. You call them VAM effects. And it has been shown that they tend to persist through the early grades. I'll mention a study that showed that later. But unfortunately, these scores are black box measures. They don't come with any kind of construct validity. They don't correlate with anything. Well, they do correlate with a lot of observational measures, but usually the correlation is around 0.1 or 0.13. You're lucky if you get those correlations up to 0.15. So in later grades, if you compute the correlation between teacher VAM scores and principal ratings, it's maybe 0.15, 0.2. If principals can't recognize why some teachers get higher VAM scores and some teachers get lower VAM scores, how do you use this as a policy tool? They're black boxes that are very difficult. Regardless of how reliable they are, they're black boxes that don't provide very good policy tools. In my opinion, some people would disagree with me. Now, the third type of effect I want to talk about is program interventions, because there have been a lot of demonstrations that programs can be effective, and there's really no doubt about that. The questions are about sustainability, as other people have already mentioned today. But going back to my previous point about what's the competitor, we broke out our effective sizes with compared to a non-treated group versus comparing to a competitor, and these are for cognitive outcomes. As you would expect, if you compare a treatment to a non-treated group, the effect size is a lot larger. And in fact, the effect size is very small when you look at alternative treatments. It turns out that the real action in these studies is not in the program versus non-program label. It's what's going on inside of both the experimental and control group. We attempted to try to get at that by looking at variables like individualization, the degree to which the program was focused on delivering additional services besides instruction, and a very interesting variable called directive instruction, which is a focus on the instruction that's happening in the experimental groups, and it could also be happening in the control groups. Usually these things are distributed randomly through studies that are not intended to contain these features, just through contextual variables. So when you do the follow-up regression of these effect sizes on all those contextual variables, you often find surprising things. And here's what, well, it looks like I don't have that information here. But it turned out the most potent variable was directive instruction. It was, the effect size was about 0.43 in the treatment groups, and it was about 0.23 in the control groups. So in both groups, the degree to which there was a focus on instructional services created larger effect sizes. So we called that being design consistent if a moderator had the same effect in the experimental group and control group. And it does matter what's happening in the control group. So here's another example of trying to figure out, interpret the results of a study based on what's happening in the experimental and control groups. This is a recent study on cognitive outcomes. I believe this was in, I believe this was also in South America. It was a professional development program for teachers, and at the end of the program, they looked to see whether the professional development had an effect on child cognitive outcomes. And they found no significant effects. But they found no significant changes in the instructional component of the class. So it's not surprising that they didn't see those effects. Now, I happen to think that a strong instructional component needs to be laid on a base where people do address socio-emotional supports. But those socio-emotional supports may give you short-term effects, and as many of you know, it may not carry through. The real carry-through is depending on the interaction between the instructional services and the socio-emotional support. Many of you now know that the third grade follow-up of the Tennessee experiment. The report was released very recently, and it's already had a significant amount of press. An effect size of 0.32 was found, but did not persist through kindergarten. 0.32 is a magic number. A lot of people find effect sizes in meta-analyses of 0.2 to 0.3, so that was not surprising. It is surprising to me that despite other studies, there was no persistence of that effect, because the claim was that that was a pretty high quality preschool intervention. And here is what the authors said in the last quote. I won't read it to you, but that's in their conclusions. Well, yes, but you got to contextualize that, right? You have to say, well, what was the quality of the instruction going on? Was it any better than the study from Ecuador? Was it better than the study from, I think the other study was from Venezuela? Right, so if there's not instructional support observed, why would you expect those effects? I think this kind of a statement screams for contextualization. Here's another odd thing about the study. Here's the effect size for applied math problems. It starts out at 0.17. By the time they get to second grade, it's minus 0.2 and significant. This is crazy, right? What kind of a program delivered in pre-K would create negative effects in second grade? My guess is that there's some kind of pernicious selection effect going on here that might have to do with a number of factors. How you impute for missing data, there's some things that you can do that, you know, will result in effects like this. But the effects from teacher ratings of students were also kind of bizarre. They were positive in kindergarten, about the same magnitude, but negative in first grade and zero thereafter. So I think that there's more of a story to be told from the Tennessee data. And I would hope that the authors of that study would make the data available for secondary analysis as soon as possible. But to be consistent with other studies, what you would see is a strong effect in pre-K, possibly diminishing towards zero in second grade. So it's not going to overturn some of the strongest, or it's not going to overturn some of the conclusions of this study, but the big thing is we don't know what the quality of the instructional services were in this program. So unless you can contextualize the study with that information, it's going to be hard to interpret, and just a general measure of quality isn't going to get you there, especially quality that exists in sort of official documents rather than observational measures. So here's the summary. Should we wait for more information on teacher influences to design programs? I don't think so. More research is good, but more research shouldn't prevent us from designing programs in the present, because it's known how to design effective programs. Some economists recommend the way you improve programs is you look at the value-added scores of teachers and you encourage teachers with low VAM scores to retire early. I think trying to suggest personnel policies based on VAM scores is not likely to be successful, because you just can't predict the kinds of workforce effects that those policies will generate. Teacher effects are sort of like dark matter. We can see the effects of it, gravitational effects of it, but we don't know the mechanism. And it may not, it's not easy to crack the that black box to see what is happening with effective teachers, but the degree the teacher effect, to the degree to which the teacher effect literature and the teaching quality literature can come together, I think that that will generate information for, useful information for designing programs. Thank you.